It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. Over the last 3/4 of a century, whether the White House was occupied by a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, there was one cornerstone of American foreign policy that every national leader and almost every American believed in without reservation: that the American system was the best in the world, that free elections and free enterprise, as practiced in the United States, demonstrated a clear path for nations all over the world to have prosperity, stability, and personal freedom. We have believed that our way, a vigorous middle ground between unfettered capitalism and state-controlled economies, summed up with the label democratic capitalism, was ultimately what saved the world from the Depression, defeated Nazism and reconstructed Europe, and ultimately vanquished Soviet communism. For Americans, that wasn't just a prescription for success, it became the heart of our national scripture. But now, something has changed. A wave of populist opposition to economic globalism helped sweep Donald Trump into the White House and has rocked elections around the world. An extreme far-right party has won seats in the German parliament for the first time since the Nazi era. President Trump is threatening to pull out of key global alliances and has embraced the motto of America First, a slogan with its own dark history. Is democratic capitalism in serious danger? Our guest in this episode is Mel Leffler, a professor of history here at the Miller Center and one of the preeminent scholars for many years of the history of American foreign relations. He's just published a remarkable new book examining American foreign policy and national security from the 1920s to the Barack Obama presidency. It's called Safeguarding Democratic Capitalism. Mel, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with what exactly is democratic capitalism. I tried to characterize it, but you don't mean, with that phrase, you don't mean just free markets or a place where there are elections. You mean something more specific.
Well, yes, I'm talking about the core values of the United States, both political values and economic values. So my emphasis, or what I imply by that title, democratic capitalism, is a combination of both political values like representative government, personal liberty, individual freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, the basic political values that we cherish in this country. At the same time, the term capitalism is to convey the notion of the primary economic principles that we care about: private property, free enterprise, a marketplace economy. And in the discussions about American foreign policy, there is much controversy. What has American foreign policy been about over the decades? Has the United States sought territorial expansion? Has it been motivated by economic imperatives, by greed? Has it been motivated alternatively by ideals or by domestic politics? And in my studies of American foreign policy, in many of the case examples I illuminate here, eventually I came to feel that the best way to frame broadly what American foreign policy is about has been safeguarding democratic capitalism.
Oftentimes when we talk about foreign policy or people referring to that, what they're imagining is the interaction between our country and other countries. But a core part of what you're talking about in terms of these values and also how those values are expressed in our society is also domestic policy and the domestic security of the country, or so the stability of the people, and the idea that foreign policy and these domestic realities are intertwined, right?
That's exactly the case. I mean, the best definition for the term national security is presented by a variety of political scientists and international relations scholars. And simply stated, a very good way to think about foreign policy is the protection of core values from external danger, protecting core values from foreign threats. So in writing about American foreign policy and national security policy, you need to analyze both the nature of the threat or threats from abroad that are challenging, that may challenge core value like national sovereignty or territorial integrity in the narrowest sense, or that might challenge more broadly the basic concepts of democracy or capitalism that we cherish. But at the same time, and what I write a lot about in this book, is that American policymakers have always understood that in order to protect core values, you need to make democratic capitalism work at home as well as promoting it abroad. And the challenge of making it viable at home has been extraordinarily difficult over time. And one of the great challenges facing American officials always is how do you reconcile domestic imperatives with foreign policy goals?
Is it right to say that what President Trump is championing and the sort of America First sort of approach is in some respects sounds like a concession that maybe our system wouldn't necessarily work all around the world in his mind, so we have to pull in internally?
Well, I don't think he's terribly concerned with the whole notion of whether it would or would not work abroad. He's very fond, in fact, he insists that the major preoccupation of American foreign policy should be to pursue American interests. Interests. He uses that term all the time, interests. He does not talk at all about the core values of liberal capitalism. He doesn't talk at all about the promotion of human rights. He doesn't talk at all really about the promotion of democracy. If you go to the webpage of whitehouse.gov and look at what it says about American foreign policy, what is the America First foreign policy? It is the pursuit of American interests. Now, how does he define interests? That's the interesting questions. All previous American presidents since World War II, broadly speaking, have defined interests in terms of an open world international economy where capital and trade and goods and people can move relatively freely. This is not what America First is all about. What America First is about, in Donald Trump's view, is the pursuit of American interests, meaning the pursuit of economic nationalism with a relative indifference to the ramifications of this for the well-being of the international economy. The irony, of course, of all of this is that most economists will tell you that American prosperity and the well-being of American workers actually depends on the well-being of the international economy. You cannot separate these two things from one another. In fact, Donald Trump always talks about, improving the plight of American workers. But the wages of American workers in America's export industries are far higher than those in other industries. So when you would imagine that other nations will begin retaliating against the United States, if in fact the policies of America First are implemented, it will hurt our export industries, and it's very much likely to hurt American workers.
And relatively recently, he spoke at the United Nations, and his first big address to the full assembly of the United Nations, and in that speech defended the America First idea partly by saying, well, everyone should be first, Ecuador first, or Great Britain first.
Right. And during the campaign, you'll remember he sort of implied and at times even said that it would be good if other nations developed nuclear weapons. I mean, it's not a terribly bad thing. Then he was educated about it. But it is striking that on the White House website right now under America First policy, even in the context in which we live today with regard to North Korea, it does not say a word about America's championing of non-proliferation, broadly defined.
So let's go back in time and sort of and talk about, as you do in the book, how we came into this period of where democratic capitalism was the predominant governing and seemingly very successful principle. But if we go back to where you were describing a moment ago, where before World War II, and in that interwar period where Americans are exhausted from the carnage of World War I, or bothered by the aftermath of the war, many people very wary about the idea of more international alliances that might pull Americans into things as ugly as what had happened. But so how did we go from this place where even FDR, very close, not long before the Pearl Harbor, was still saying, I'm going to keep us out of this European conflict? And I bring this up partly because I think it speaks to the difficulty of this balancing act, even in the present or in the past decade, where on the one hand, there are these strategic interests and strategic imperatives that face the country and the national leaders must confront, but you may also have among the people a sense of exhaustion or a failure to understand exactly why these things are so important. Is there any sort of a parallel between the dichotomy of more recent times and the period that you're talking about, where the people and the leaders may not have had exactly the same understanding of all of this?
Well, public opinion is often a constraint on policy, but leaders also have the capacity to shape public opinion. So, what we now, you keep using the term that that Americans were totally disillusioned with World War I and therefore didn't want to really join the League of Nations. This was, Woodrow Wilson's fantastic imaginary illusion that we should join this league, but the American people were against it. We didn't have public opinion polling in those days, but to the extent that we can judge public opinion by the thousands of newspapers that were very popular in those days and that in a sense reflected public opinion, the majority of newspapers in the country actually supported the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. So what happened was that Republicans were elected, and Republican leaders, Warren Harding and Herbert Hoover, decided that for whatever reasons, and they were complicated reasons, the United States should not join the League of Nations and should not incur the obligations that inhered in the League of Nations. Could public opinion have been shaped in an alternative direction in 1919 and 1920? I think that most observers today, most scholars today would think that was definitely conceivable. Now, just because the United States would have been a member of the League of Nations does not mean the whole trajectory of post-war history would have been different. But it does show that different leaders could have shaped opinion in a different way. But throughout, I would say, policymakers have the capacity to shape public opinion. A great example of this, a wonderful example, was after World War II in 1946 and 47 and 48. In 1946, the Republicans smashed the Democrats in the congressional elections of 1946. President Truman suffered a devastating congressional defeat. It was not a presidential election year, he wasn't running, but for the first time since the beginning of the Great Depression, the Republicans took over. Republicans wanted to cut taxes. They wanted less government. They were extremely preoccupied with spiraling inflation. And in the next few months, President Harry Truman introduces the most successful policy program of the entire Cold War, the European Recovery Act, what we call the Marshall Plan. Initially, people were not supportive of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the antithesis of what Republicans stood for. The Truman administration went on a huge public relations campaign, a very focused campaign to try to mobilize public opinion to support the Marshall Plan and the European Recovery Act. They were successful. It was an extraordinarily close vote when it actually was passed in early 1948. It shows, again, public opinion is a constraint, but it can be shaped in different ways.
But what seems to emerge from that period is not just this big change of opinion or this coalescence of support around the Marshall Plan, but also a broader consensus of that this kind of activity, this kind of engagement in the world is a good idea and is part of this narrative that Americans really fall in love with of our role in the world, our role for good. But so when we look at these recent times, and clearly in terms of the preemptive measures taken, this long history, it does seem that what was seen as the narrative of the significance of this change was partly that, one, it had to do with the rise of these non-state actors, and did that mean that a different set of rules applied in some fashion? I guess one way to look at it might be that where the United States had been involved in assassinations of national leaders at many points along the way and preemptive military measures at many points in the past, particularly around the assassination of leaders or regime changes, there was at least some desire to conceal the American involvement in that. There was a sense that that was not necessarily something that the United States should own up to. One change that did happen after 9/11 was an embrace of this idea that, well, of course, if we have the capacity to assassinate a leader of a terrorist organization that we think might be planning to injure our interests or attack our country, it's a justified thing for us to take this preemptive action. I mean, but that did represent something of a change. I'm asking if it did. But also, I'm curious if you could talk about the Clinton, Bush, Obama comparisons, where all three of them did certainly state that a right of preemptive action and held on to these rights and maybe tried to expand them, but then used them in somewhat different ways, where Clinton asserted the right, but then did not, in the end, appeared somewhat timid about whether to actually use it, to exercise those rights. Bush then exercised them very forcefully, some would say recklessly. Obama then struggled mightily with trying to develop a legal basis, as he would have said, for the use of those powers and restraining American intervention, but then in the end also became very criticized for some of that restraint. But is that what about that distinction and how those three recent presidents have used it?
Well, I think when you talk about continuities or discontinuities between Clinton and Bush 43 and President Obama, that you need to keep in mind, first of all, the perception of threat from abroad. So President Clinton sort of talked about it and prepared for possible preventative action and certainly was on the verge of taking action at various times in Afghanistan against Osama bin Laden when he was spotted there or thought to have been spotted, but then decided for very complex reasons that probably should not undertake those actions. Fast forward, I mean, President Bush, after 9/11, obviously not only took action in Afghanistan, but then went to war in Iraq. The perceived level of threat, the magnitude of fear, had an enormous amount to do with what policymakers decided they should accomplish. So the degree of external threat has a huge amount to do with the resources that you're going to invest in overcoming that threat. Then Barack Obama becomes president. Does he totally change American foreign policy? Yes. As I said before, Iraq is the bad war. We better we better disengage from Iraq, and hopefully the incumbent government will be able to preserve itself. But at the same time, he too believed that, you could not afford to allow terrorists to regain a safe haven. President Obama repudiated the policies of extraterritorial rendition, of torture, etc. immediately. Nonetheless, he actually engaged in far more efforts to use drones to assassinate individual leaders. I mean, he's using drones to kill, more reprehensible than torture. I think reasonable people will argue about that.
You wrote had an essay recently published in Foreign Policy magazine that I think you didn't write the headline, but the headline said something along the lines of the worst first year in foreign policy ever, referring to the first year of the Trump administration. But then the essay that you wrote is actually nowhere nearly as loaded as that headline would suggest. And in fact, you say in the course of the essay that you identify a laundry list of what could be seen as failures or not the best moves by the president, but you also hold open the possibility that he could learn from these mistakes, as many presidents have early in their presidencies, and a different course could emerge. But just put, as succinctly as you can, put the Trump administration thus far into this sequence, where you see it as either threat to democratic capitalism, or how it could be a defender of democratic capitalism, and how it should turn in order to accomplish that.
Well, I mean, I can be very succinct, because I don't think that President Trump supports democratic capitalism. So he is really an exception. I don't think he would not embrace the goals of democratic capitalism. Now, some of his advisors absolutely do. So part of what I see as the tension within the administration is that he has advisors around him, including his Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor, and his Secretary of State, who actually believe in the continuity of American foreign policy, who believe in the pursuit, broadly defined, of democratic capitalism and relatively open world order, the support of allies, the championing of democracy, the importance of diplomacy. His key advisors, I think, support all these things to one degree or another, but it's unclear if Donald Trump believes in these things himself. As I said much earlier, he does not seem to believe in America's core values as we have defined them since World War II, perhaps as we've defined them maybe since the history of the Republic. It is a very big change. On the other hand, why I hated that headline, that the editors just stuck on it to attract attention, it did, by the way, it attracted a lot of attention.
Congratulations.
Is that, truthfully, so far, in terms of foreign policy, it has not been the worst first year ever. I mean, John Kennedy would have told you, I've just had the worst first year after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, after the Berlin Wall went up, after what he regarded, wrongly I would say, but what he regarded as his unsuccessful diplomacy at the Vienna summit with Nikita Khrushchev. He regarded his first year, as my colleague Mark Silverstone has written, as a disaster, and it was. Or think about George W. Bush and his first year, 9/11. So there have been a lot worse first years. But what I'm trying to say is that many of the problems that we can see led to those disasters in 1961 with Kennedy or 2001 with George W. Bush. Many of the internal workings and functioning of the administration are being replicated within the Trump. In fact, they are magnified within the Trump administration. So could one easily conceive of a disaster as great as those? Yes, I think one could. And I think we may be on the verge of seeing that materialize in terms of, North Korea, or perhaps over the next few months with regard to Iran. This is still the first year. and the dysfunctionality within this administration and the unique qualities of our president, which some people regard as great, 35%, and 65% are very worried about it. I mean, that the unique qualities of this president cast a specter of danger over everything that this country is engaged in. So yes, we have a lot to worry about. It could be indeed the worst first year, even though it hasn't been so far.
Well, it's a somber note for us to end on, but I think we should. Mel Leffler, thank you so much for being here.
No, thanks.
If you'd like to share a comment or ask a question about this or any other episode of American Forum, I'm easy to find on email or on Twitter. My handle is @DouglasBlackman. To get more information on American Forum or just to learn something about how presidents make crucial decisions, visit us at millercenter.org. You can also watch live tapings of every episode of this program at the Miller Center Facebook page. Thanks for watching. See you next week. All right.